gloomy funeral scene where Macbeth and his wife, Lady Macbeth, mourn the death of their child. Macbeth burns the corpse of his child while the crowd witnesses the funeral. 3 witches and a young girl stand on the same ground and discuss their next reunion. One of the witches declares that they will next meet to visit Macbeth on a battlefield. A civil war rages in Scotland as MacDonald, a former loyal to King Duncan, unites a troop of mercenaries against the king's rule. This civil war causes unrest, turning people against the rule. The king learns about the traitor and orders Macbeth, Thane of Glamis, to lead an army against MacDonald's in the Battle of Ellon. The troops arrive at the Foggy Heath to battle the MacDonald army. The men prepare for the battle, marking young men to fight. As the battle commences and Macbeth bravely battles his way through a pool of enemy mercenaries, his movements halt after witnessing a strange sight. Macbeth sees 3 women standing at a distance behind a blanket of fog. Macbeth regains his senses and starts fighting again but witnesses the death of the young boy who he failed to save. However, Macbeth doesn't lose his calm and advances towards MacDonald and his men standing at a distance, witnessing the whole war. Macbeth mercilessly slices MacDonald's head off and attains victory for King Duncan. On the other hand, King Duncan is given the good news of victory as the whole battle and tales of Macbeth's bravery are narrated to him. King Duncan rejoices in his achievement as his son Malcolm returns from Fife. Malcolm brings the traitor, Thane of Cawdor, with him, presenting him to the king. As King Duncan removes the royal scarf from the traitor's neck, he declares his execution and announces his title as the Thane of Cawdor to be given to Macbeth for his fierce victory. The traitor is executed by being shot with arrows. After the battle, Macbeth and Banquo gather the dead bodies of all the troops until Macbeth sees the 3 women, witches' sisters again, this time with an infant and a young girl. Macbeth asks the 3 women about their identity, presence, in the battlefield, seeming to collect things from dead soldiers. The witches walk closer to Macbeth, naming him Thane of Cawdor and the coming king. They prophesize that Macbeth will soon become the Thane of Cawdor and later rule as the king. They also foretell that Banquo will be a father to kings. Macbeth asks them what they mean, but the witches stay silent and disappear in thin air. Later, 2 men from Duncan's tent arrive at Heath and announce King's message. They deliver King's heavy praise for Macbeth's heroic victory and offer Macbeth a box of the royal scarf, passing him the title of the Thane of Cawdor. Both Banquo and Macbeth confirm the prophecy as one of the predictions comes out to be true. Macbeth rides back with his troops to meet King Duncan. He gives him the head of MacDonald as a war gift and, in return, invites the king to his camp for a feast and to meet his wife. The king, pleased by Macbeth's win, accepts the invitation. Lady Macbeth sits at her secluded dark church where she receives her husband's parcel, a box with the Thane of Cawdor title royal scarf, and a written message about the victory and the prophecy he received. Lady Macbeth then turns herself to the dark spirits and prays to them for help. The overly ambitious Lady Macbeth begs for her husband's position as the king. Upon Macbeth's return to the camp with his troops, he informs his wife that King Duncan will be staying the night, which pleases Lady Macbeth. She manipulates her husband into killing the king. Although Macbeth is initially hesitant, Lady Macbeth convinces him that this is the only way to fulfill the prophecy and become king. King Duncan arrives at the camp with his son Malcolm and other nobles, and Lady Macbeth hosts him warmly. She arranges a feast and entertainment for him. After the dinner, King Duncan announces Malcolm as the Prince of Cumberland in the presence of all his nobles. On the other hand, Macbeth feels slightly uneasy thinking about the crime he will commit. After a lot of thinking, Macbeth refuses to commit the crime and tells his wife that he won't be proceeding with the plan. His wife hears this and calls him a coward for not having enough vigor to kill the king. She taunts him for not being a man enough and then starts emotionally blackmailing him with the death of their son. Macbeth fears getting caught and failing, but Lady Macbeth reassures him that he won't, and if he does, she will gladly take the fall with him. Macbeth melts in, and the two make love. While they indulge in the love act, Lady Macbeth narrates the whole plan she made. She tells him that she has poured a sleeping potion into the wines of the king's guards so the king will remain unguarded at night. She orders Macbeth to kill him during that time. As the night falls, Macbeth starts getting cold feet again, stressing about the evil he's about to commit. He recalls all the battles he fought and all the people who died because of him. Macbeth starts hallucinating and sees the young soldier who he failed to save at the Battle of Ellon. The hallucination of the young boy psychologically convinces him to commit the murder and hands him the dagger to kill King Duncan. Macbeth walks to King Duncan's tent, finding him sleeping peacefully. He notices his two guards lying unconscious after being given the portion. Macbeth advances toward King Duncan's bed and stabs the king in the heart twice, brutally murdering him in the night. Malcolm comes in the night to visit Duncan but sees blood splattered everywhere while Macbeth sits beside the body. Malcolm tears up seeing the sight, but Macbeth confronts him and blackmails to kill him if he utters a word. Malcolm is left with no choice, so he secretly escapes at night, under heavy rain. Macbeth returns to his wife and kisses her as she proudly smiles at him for committing the deed. She then notices the daggers and gets furious at him for bringing those along. She quickly returns to the tent and places the daggers in the hands of the unconscious guards outside the tent so that all the blame goes on them. Macbeth returns to his room, feeling guilty seeing his blood-painted hands. Lady Macbeth comes in and sees her husband in a horrified state. She shows him her hands, coated with the same blood, and tells him she shares the shame with him. She washes his hands with the rainwater and claims that the water washed away their sin with the blood, and it was this easy to get rid of the evil stain on their lives. The next day, Lord Macduff, Thane of Fife, Macbeth, and Lennox head to King's tent to wake him up. Macduff enters the tent but comes out in horror and disgust after seeing Duncan's brutally stabbed dead body. The news spreads around as Macduff cries out and announces the murder of the king, waking everyone up. Lady Macbeth and Banquo enter the tent and see King lying dead. The noble notices the blood-covered daggers in the hands of the night guards, raising suspicion. Macbeth quickly slits their throats. The grand funeral is carried out for the king as everyone mourns his death. However, some gossip raised suspicion about the sudden disappearance of Duncan's son Malcolm, who was announced as the prince and his next heir. Banquo starts doubting Macbeth as he is the only one, other than Lady Macbeth, who knows about the prophecy. Banquo fears for his son. Later, the coronation ceremony is held at the castle where Macbeth is regarded with the royal crown and declared the new reigning king of Scotland. Everyone at the castle, including the nobles, thanes, and their royal families, hail for Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, who is announced as the queen. Banquo greets Macbeth and looks at him suspiciously. Macbeth doubts that Banquo might know of his ill deeds. Macbeth expresses concern to his wife about the potential threat posed by Banquo, as the prophecy had stated that Banquo's son would become king. Lady Macbeth tries to reassure him and suggests focusing on the post-coronation feast instead. Macbeth, however, is determined to prevent the prophecy from coming true and wants his son to become the heir to the throne. Lady Macbeth is worried as she observes her husband's descent into evil. Banquo feels threatened by Macbeth's corrupt intentions and suspects he might harm him and his son. Macbeth invites Banquo and his son to a feast at his palace, but Banquo plans to escape with his son to save their lives. Macbeth learns about their plan and orders his men to follow and kill them. In a forest, Macbeth's men brutally murder Banquo, but Fleance manages to escape and save himself. In the evening, Macbeth commences the feast with all the nobles and governors. He highlights the absence of Banquo, which was promised, deeming it a negative gesture. Macbeth's men arrive at the feast and inform him that Banquo has been killed. They also inform him that Fleance escaped, which makes him furious. Macbeth starts having an episode again where he hallucinates and sees Banquo's ghost staring at him. Macbeth starts talking to the ghost, projecting mad behavior. Everyone at the feast starts gossiping about the king's psychological behavior. Lady Macbeth tries to cover it up, saying that her husband is unwell. She tries to hold and stop Macbeth, but he sees Banquo's ghost and feels guilty for it. Macbeth continues to rage and cry, provoking Macduff and his wife to leave the feast. Macbeth questions his wife's calmness despite their terrible actions, and Lennox asks him what he is talking about. Lady Macbeth ends the feast and sends everyone home. Macbeth decides to visit the three witches and inquire about what threats he holds. This time, the witches warn him about Macduff and reassure him that he will stay safe until the trees of the Burnham Woods forest move towards the castle. Macbeth sighs in relief, knowing that trees can never move independently. The witches project a hallucination for him where he sees all his dead soldiers and the people who died because of him. The ghost of the young soldier appears again in the hallucination, telling Macbeth that no man born of a woman can harm him. This pleases Macbeth, knowing that every man is born out of a woman so no one can kill him. Macbeth decides to handle Macduff and eradicate the threat. On the other hand, Macduff leaves for England, bidding his wife and family farewell. He goes to see Malcolm, who had escaped on the night of Duncan's murder. Lennox informs him that Macduff has fled to England. This infuriates Macbeth more, so he decides to harm him in other ways. He orders his men to capture Macduff's family and servants. Lady Macbeth tries to stop him, warning him and reminding him that hell is murky and that he needs to let go of the horrors and sins. Macbeth remains unfazed and tells his wife he will end all his fears. Lady Macduff runs through the forest with her kids, crying for help and mercy as Macbeth's men chase her. However, they fail to escape and get captured. Lady Macduff and her 3 young children are tied to wooden bars in the open air, inviting everyone to watch. Macbeth comes in with firewood in his hand and announces Macduff's family as enemies. Lady Macduff screams and cries for help, but no one defies the ruthless King Macbeth. Macbeth mercilessly publicly burns the whole family as people watch in atrocity and shock. Everyone tears up at the event, including Lady Macbeth, who watches her husband's downfall and cries at the mother begging for the life of her children. In England, Malcolm receives the news of the horrifying murder by his men. Macduff meets Malcolm in England and asks his soldiers about the well-being of his family. Malcolm reveals the brutal assassination of his wife, children, and servants. Macduff cries out loud in extreme pain and decides to reunite forces with Malcolm against Macbeth, who they confirm as the real murderer of King Duncan. The two raise an army of 10,000 men against Macbeth. In Scotland, Lady Macbeth starts to feel guilty about the murders and turning her husband into a monster. She washes the daggers used to kill Duncan and then leaves for the church where she once resided. She cries and begs for forgiveness, unable to take the burden of her crimes. Lady Macbeth also starts hallucinating and sees her dead child at the church. She calls him towards her and offers to put him to sleep. She realizes that she needs to end all her misery and finally put herself to sleep. Later she wanders on the same hills and sees the witches from afar. She returns to the palace. Macbeth's men inform him about the arrival of English forces led by Macduff and Malcolm, but Macbeth isn't worried at all as he is confident about the prophecies the witches gave him. He orders his men to prepare mercenaries to fight the battle. Later, as Macbeth prepares for the war, the doctors inform Macbeth that his wife has died. Macbeth, void of fear and grieves, embraces his wife's dead body and says he feels no emotions of fear. Later, Macbeth calls for his man Satan and tells him he will fight the war until the end. He then calls for his armor and sets for the battle. Macduff burns the Burnham Woods forest as all the smoke prevails, covering the castle in a cloud of thick red smoke. The burnt orange blaze covers the whole land. Macbeth witnesses the whole scene and remembers the prophecy that says that Macbeth will survive until Burnham Woods moves to the castle. The whole prophecy unravels right in front of his eyes. He remains hopeful about the second part of the prophecy that no man born of a woman can harm him. Macbeth proceeds to the battle alone and bravely fights every single soldier. Macduff challenges him in a duel as now only the two fight using their daggers and swords. The two indulge in an intense sword fight until the strong Macbeth successfully captures Macduff under him, sitting on top of him with his dagger pointed at his throat, yet to kill him. Macbeth narrates the prophecy to Macduff, gloating that he will not be harmed by a man born of a woman. Macduff spits back and reveals that he was never born of his mother but was untimely ripped out of her womb. Macbeth hears the revelation and drops his dagger, unable to process the prophecy defeating him. The guilt trip hits him as he refuses to battle anymore and change the prophecy. Macbeth realizes his sins are too much for any redemption. The 3 witches also watch the whole fight, seeing the prophecy turning true. Malcolm, the sole heir to the throne, sits on his horse, witnessing the battle. He asks Macbeth to accept his defeat and bow down to him. But Macbeth refuses to bow down and asks for him to be killed in honor instead. He hallucinates and watches all the soldiers he killed before. Macbeth stabs himself using Macduff's dagger. Everyone hails Malcolm, the new king of Scotland. Malcolm arrives at the palace and holds the crown and the throne, realizing that he is now the sole king, whereas, at the battlefield, the young Fleance arrives and picks up Macbeth's sword, walking to the palace.